Hi, this lecture is on imperialism. Empire building is as old as history itself and has been a prominent theme for thousands of years. Modern imperialism is when a dominant nation extends its authority over another nation or region. Colonialism falls within the larger category of imperialism. With colonialism, part of the population of the dominant nation moves to the conquered region and reproduces the institutions of the home country. The colonialist culture rises and overshadows the culture of conquered peoples. Imperialism can be by territorial acquisition and colonization, and it can be by economic and political hegemony where there is no official formation of a colony. Some countries created colonies while others dominated a region economically or politically without taking possession of land. World history reveals the pervasiveness of imperialism. In one form or another, it took place on every continent and in every era of history. The outcomes were both negative and positive. On the negative side, imperialism was aggressive, ranging from mild to extreme. Pointing to what occurred in the Americas, economist Thomas Sowell writes, quote, "The often tragic history of Western Hemisphere Indians parallels the history of conquered peoples around the world, not only in terms of the suffering endured, but also in terms of the betrayals of agreements and the contempt often shown to the subjugated peoples." As they had done with each other in earlier centuries, Europeans fought for land, and they broke agreements with the people they encountered. In the Americas and earlier in Europe, Africa, and Asia, stronger groups prevailed over weaker groups. On a more positive note, the clashing of cultures in imperialism often resulted in a sharing of technology and the possibility of improvements for all. The lands lost to indigenous peoples had value, but that value was greatly exceeded by the wealth created after the land and other natural resources passed from populations that included many hunter-gatherers to more urbanized and eventually industrialized societies. The culture of the imperialist nation was especially extensive in a colony where the population was comprised mostly of people from the mother country. Canada, for example, saw the rise of British culture in much of the land stretching from the colony of Nova Scotia to the colony of British Columbia. The colony of Quebec was a notable exception, retaining significant French culture. Although imperialism often saw a vast gulf between the rulers and the ruled, there were cases where indigenous people exercised some control. With the British possessions in Asia and Africa, a British elite administered the conquered territory, but gave some power to local indigenous officials who learned English and other skills necessary for the governing of society at the local level. This represented a policy of an indirect rule. Colonialism typically combined different people groups into much larger governmental units, far beyond anything achieved by any one indigenous group. Consequently, when European imperialism failed in the 20th century, one outcome was fragmentation. In the 20th century, independence for former colonies brought hope, but the historical record is mixed. Many new nations formed in Africa and Asia witnessed post-independence polarization and violence between different tribes and groups. Later, I'll say more on this. The two greatest imperial powers of Europe in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were Great Britain and Germany, both ruled by monarchs. Great Britain was the center of the Western world, based on both territorial size and population. It had the largest global empire. British shippers controlled world trade, and London had a major stake in world finance. Germany included the old state of Prussia. Forged in war, the German state upheld the glorification of the army and of military might. Emperor William II encouraged his government to build a strong army and navy, and also to extend colonial territories. The so-called world policy that the emperor embraced was a major challenge to Britain. A spirit of conquest was the norm as European powers sought to expand their colonial territories. The British, Germans, and other Europeans did not question the superiority of their societies. The belief was that until Europeans rescued an undeveloped area from native societies, the area would remain underdeveloped. Colonization was considered a noble and civilizing venture. In this period, racial prejudice and cultural stereotypes were universal. Europeans often had little understanding of the peoples they wanted to colonize. Joseph Arthur de Gobineau, he wrote an essay on the inequality of the human races, placed Europeans at the top of the racial hierarchy. Some intellectuals embrace social Darwinism to explain racial and cultural superiority. The social Darwinism of thinkers such as Herbert Spencer was seen as justification for European dominance over the colonies. Notions of cultural superiority were also common in Asia without the assistance of social Darwinian theory. For centuries, the Chinese saw non-Chinese peoples as inferior. There were notable cases of resistance when cultures clashed between rulers and the ruled. What unfolded in India in 1857 is a good example. India became the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. In 1857, Indian soldiers, known as sepoys, employed by the British East India Company, were upset with the introduction of a new Enfield rifle with its distinct ammunition, which required the soldier to bite off the end of a gunpowder cartridge before loading. There was misunderstanding and false rumors about the grease used on the cartridge. Indians believed that the grease contained fat from cattle or from pigs. These were serious issues. And certainly there were serious symbolic implications to it. Cows were considered sacred by the Hindu, and Muslims considered pigs to be polluting. In the eyes of the Indians, the British were attacking Hindu and Muslim religious beliefs, and mutiny resulted that caused the death of over 10,000 Britons and many more thousands of Indians. Atrocities such as the Cawnpore massacre, when many British soldiers, women and children were killed by Indian soldiers, or the British habit of blowing Indian rebels up with cannons, meant that any earlier mutual respect or tolerance were gone. From that point, India was clearly a nation of rulers and ruled. While the British may have won complete control over India, competition was the normal situation almost everywhere else. As part of the great game, the Russians and British competed for dominion over Central Asia. In the end, however, the Russian dream of taking control of India came to nothing. The history of British India reveals much on imperialism. The British imperialists had lumped together all Indians who had significant conflicts with each other based mostly on competing religions. When the British exited India in 1947, there was much carnage and violence. At least 1 million people were killed in mob violence as Hindus and Muslims jockeyed for land and power. The political result was the formation of India and Pakistan, but each nation continued to experience internal conflict and conflict with each other. The scramble for Africa in the late 19th century displayed European imperialism at its most frantic. From the year 1870 to 1900, almost all of Africa, 1/5 of the world's landmass, was carved up by the Europeans. The Berlin Conference of 1884-1885, when heads of state met to discuss their claims to Africa, this was laying the groundwork for the European division of the continent. By 1900, only Ethiopia and Liberia remained independent. In the 20th century, Africans became politically independent, but the process saw much violence. One example is Nigeria. When the British established colonial Nigeria, the political borders resulted in the throwing together of the Hausa Fulani tribes of the north with the Ibos and Yorubas and other tribes elsewhere. When Britain pulled out in 1960, an independent Nigeria experienced intertribal mob violence and a terrible civil war. In the beginning, the Nigerian borders had not been formed by indigenous people who understood the tribal factionalism of the region. The United States and Japan joined the Western Europeans as imperialist competitors in the 19th century. The roots of American imperialism stretch back to the issuance of the Monroe Doctrine in 1823. While warning the Europeans away from the Western Hemisphere, the Monroe Doctrine also justified later American intervention in Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, Honduras, and Haiti. The purchase of Alaska from Russia in 1867 and the annexation of Hawaii in 1898 expressed the growing US interest in the Pacific world. Victory over Spain in the Spanish-American War resulted in American control of Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. A rebellion in Panama, actively supported by Theodore Roosevelt, led to American domination of the Panama Canal. Japan's rise as a significant imperial power began in 1876 with the Meiji Restoration. This abolished the old feudal order, it revamped the tax system, and it remodeled the economy. Japan was on its way to being an industrial powerhouse. Upgrading its military status, Japan modernized and restructured its army and navy and began imperialistic expansion. Hokkaido, Okinawa, and Kuril Islands and the Rylev Islands, all of these fell to Japan in the 1870s. The Japanese, displaying the same manner of gunboat diplomacy that the British and Americans had mastered, forced Korea to accept an unequal trade treaty. Japan increased its rule over Korea with its victory in the Sino-Japanese War of 1898-1895, the Japanese victory over Russia in the Russo-Japanese War, which took place in 1904-1905, was further evidence of Japan's rise to the status of a world power. Into the 20th century, Japan was on the verge of acquiring even greater power. There are many explanations for imperialism. No one explanation can explain the reason for every type and example of imperialism. First, sheer political opportunism was often a factor. Political leaders could gain status for any acquisition or control of land. Second, imperialism could be a simple case of national pride. The growing and aggressive nationalism of the 19th century encouraged competition between new and advanced nation states. It was a contest of what nation could score the best territories. Three, imperial control could improve the nation's military or security status. Various regions were conquered for strategic reasons. For example, British occupation of Egypt was necessary to protect the Suez Canal that played a key role in the trade of the British Empire. Four, a weakening of an older empire sometimes encouraged imperialism. The decline of the Ottoman Empire, for example, led to greater Western involvement in the Middle East. Five, European imperialism could occur due to decisions made by those on the scene rather than by politicians back in Europe. Six, in some cases, there was a connection between missionary activity and imperialism. European missionaries traveled to all corners of the world to spread the gospel message of sin and salvation. Politicians sometimes justified imperialism on the grounds of moral duty and humanitarianism. Christians certainly did shine a light on oppressive actions, such as the burning of widows when their husbands died, a Hindu practice carried out in India, or the child abuse in China, when young girls had their feet bound tightly for years. Of all the explanations, economics as a motivation for imperialism has generated the most debate. Socialist theories hold that imperialism was all about economic exploitation of a weaker nation or territory by a more powerful nation. In 1902, leftist intellectual J.A. Hobson embraced a capital export argument to explain imperialism. The key for Hobson was that British industry produced too much. Wealthy British citizens could not consume all of it, and poor citizens could not afford it. Thus, capital had to be exported. Put another way, business resorted to imperialism to gain political control over areas which they could invest their surplus capital and sell their surplus products. Hobson even added a racial theme to his theory. For him, imperialism represented a deliberate act of wickedness by finance capital, often Jewish. Marxists found Hobson's work compelling. Decades earlier, Karl Marx had predicted that there would be an increasing proletariat misery followed by the self-destruction of capitalism. Revolutionary socialism, better known as communism, continued to attract the attention of passionate intellectuals and activists, even though it was obvious that Marx was wrong with almost all his predictions. Vladimir Lenin's theory of imperialism was an attempt to answer such flawed prophecies. Claiming that imperialism became the highest stage of capitalism, Lenin wrote of the super profits gained by a small number of rich and powerful states that plundered the world of exports. With such wealth, capitalists successfully bribed labor leaders in 1,000 different ways into accepting capitalism. Part of Lenin's argument was based on statistics on foreign investments by European nations. However, one of the flaws of his research was the use of huge and heterogeneous categories. For example, America in his classification was the entire Western Hemisphere. In his study, there was no breakdown on whether the European investments were for industrial or non-industrial areas. Economists argue that the history of the Western imperial advance fails to support such socialist arguments. As early as the 18th century, Adam Smith argued that international trade was a source of mutual benefit. Imperialism was regarded as a losing venture. Imperialism's focus on appropriation rather than creating wealth was a problem in Smith's analysis of earlier imperialism. It was discovered that imperialism was very expensive to maintain. The cost of maintaining an army in a colony was far greater than the economic gains. Moreover, the economic gains from imperialism typically went to a small class of wealthy businessmen and colonial officials. Other classical economists, such as David Ricardo, saw that the colonial model was contrary to the general economic interests of the mother country. Ricardo, who wrote Principles of Political Economy published in 1807, was a staunch free trader who introduced the theory of comparative advantage. For example, two nations should specialize in the production of goods that they can produce more efficiently than the other nation and then exchange their surpluses. Specialization would increase efficiency in both countries, expand total output, and improve prospects for prosperity. Economist Thomas Sowell's reply to Vladimir Lenin's insinuation that weaker states absorb the foreign investment of powerful states was that industrial nations tended to send their foreign investments to other industrial countries rather than underdeveloped states. When imperial ventures in Africa blossomed in the late 19th century, it was the United States rather than Africa that was the largest single recipient of British, German, and Dutch capital. Also, the British made its heaviest imperial investments not when it was accumulating new colonies in the late 1800s. Overall, European investment in colonies was rather modest. Most capital went to America and European nations rather than colonies. Statistical data showed that underdeveloped states had not served as a safety valve for capitalist nations. Agreeing with the economists, historians acknowledge that controlling new colonies was not particularly profitable. Historian Paul Johnson writes that colonialism contained far too many unresolved contradictions to be a source of strength. The colonies were not a source of strength, but of weakness. Economic historian Rondo Cameron explains, quote, It is true that colonies did in some cases furnish new sources of raw materials, but access to raw materials did not require political control. In fact, the Americas and self-governing dominions of Australasia were the largest overseas suppliers of raw materials for European industry. Paul Johnson concludes that, on the whole, colonial powers served the interests of local inhabitants best when they allowed market forces to prevail. The recent book, Why Nations Fail, discusses how capitalism and the legality and protection of private property could advance the economic fortunes of poor nations. However, imperialism did not guarantee prosperity for ordinary people of colonies. African tribal chiefs, for example, might oppose European ways because property rights for the African masses would decrease the power of the chiefs. In early African history, property was slaves rather than land. Stronger tribes gained wealth by enslaving other Africans, eventually selling them to the highest bidder, be it the transatlantic slave trade or the Islamic slave trade. Whatever the motivations and dynamics of imperialism, it was clear that modern technology influenced the pace of imperialism. The world had become a smaller place for late 19th century Europeans. Steam, iron, and electricity were responsible for shrinking the globe. Such technology was a result of European industrialization. Steam was an excellent source of transportation. That is, an excellent source of energy for transportation. Great iron steamships offered the means to transport large cargoes of peoples and goods more quickly than ever before. These ocean-going steamships effectively joined colonies to the home countries. While technology improved European mobility on water, it literally moved the land. For example, the machines allowed for bigger canals and deeper harbors. As early as 1869, the Suez Canal was built by the French that connected the Mediterranean and Red Sea. Technology also improved communication immensely. In the early 19th century, it would have taken approximately 2 years for someone in India to receive a reply from Great Britain. With the development of the telegram, communication between Bombay and London took only a few hours. Improvements in medicine played a role in imperialism. The deadly disease malaria, for example, could be treated with quinine. Western medicine has eventually alleviated the suffering of countless people. In earlier years, Europeans in the African slave trade rarely went into the interior for African slaves. And this was because of the real possibility of these deadly diseases. Slave gathering was done by other Africans of different tribes. Other technological advances could be of a more destructive nature. Repeating rifles, machine guns, and advanced weapons were far more effective than the primitive weapons that people in the colonial regions had for their protection and for fighting. Industrialization created the tools of transportation, communication, and power that encouraged the rapid pace of global empire building of the new imperialism. The emergence of modernized international economy spurred industrialists, miners, engineers, and bankers to seek business opportunities. From the plains of India to the jungles of Central America, railroad companies built transportation networks. There were those who were critical of imperialism, But imperial ventures such as railroad construction did make transportation and trade easier for millions of people in the respective colonies. Imperialism is a vital topic of world history because there is the theme of power, rulers and the ruled. Imperialism generates much debate. There is scholarship suggesting the benefits often outweighed the harms, and there are those who argue the very opposite, seeing imperialism mostly as a destructive force. However, most agree that empire building and imperialism have been the human experience in all parts of the world since biblical times. The modern imperialism of the 19th and 20th centuries especially stand out given the abundance of colonial and government records, newspaper, magazine reports, countless accounts by people who wrote about the imperial experience, various other studies and books that focus on imperialism. Never in the empires of earlier centuries was there this level of information and analysis. Thank you.